It was the kind of night that hospitals never like to speak about out loud. A tiny cot, a team of exhausted nurses, a parent asleep in the chair beside their newborn. At 0:46 on a June night in 2015, a premature baby who had been stable minutes earlier gasped, went limp, and blue-lipped hands scrambled to find a heartbeat. A resuscitation team fought for life. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Against the clinical whiteness of the neonatal unit, something dark had happened, and when the baby did not recover, the room filled not just with grief, but with questions. Who would hurt a newborn? Who could hide violence behind a nurse's badge and a comforting voice? This is the story of the nurse next door, the quiet presence on the ward who prosecutors say murdered infants while the rest of the hospital slept. This is the story of how routine became lethal, how patterns were missed, and how families were left to pick up the pieces. To understand how this could happen, we must start in a place that most of us associate with safety and hope, a neonatal unit. The Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal ward cared for the tiniest patients, premature babies, fragile lungs, delicate hearts. Nurses worked long shifts, often at the edge of sleep, balancing monitors, medication charts, and parental fear. She was a nurse in that unit. She had trained locally. She wore the same uniform as her colleagues, carried the same pens, clocked the same shifts. She smiled in photographs. Family members and neighbors remember a reserved, ordinary person with a steady job and a quiet life. She was outwardly unremarkable. But between June 2015 and June 2016, staff began to notice a statistical oddity, a cluster of collapses and deaths in the neonatal unit that exceeded the norm. Small wards sometimes see tragedy, but statistics even in grief were whispering that something had shifted. The unit that usually recorded 2 or 3 deaths a year had far more incidents in a short span of months. Clinicians raised concerns internally. Reviews were held, yet early explanations were framed as unfortunate errors, coincidence, or the cruel randomness of neonatal medicine. It would take years before suspicion hardened into investigation, and years more before those suspicions reached a courtroom. Families who brought babies to the neonatal unit did so with hope pinned to fragile lungs. They did not expect to return home with grief. The clinical staff, consultants, nurses, unit managers were human, overworked, proud of their work, sometimes defensive about their team. Among them was a lead neonatologist who, after months of unusual incidents, would ask management to remove one nurse from clinical duties pending inquiry. His concerns began the cascade that changed everything. The police who eventually took on the case were drawn in after clinicians asked for an external look at whether deaths could be from unnatural causes. With every hospital file reviewed, every shift rota checked, a pattern. Some argued statistical, some argued circumstantial began to emerge. In a neonatal unit, minutes matter. A tiny change in oxygen saturation, a sudden fall in heart rate, an alarm that jolts the night shift awake. These are the rhythms of vigilance. But in the summer months of 2015, alarms began to scream with a frequency that startled staff. Babies who had been stable hours before were collapsing. In some cases, despite frantic resuscitation attempts, the infants would not be revived. Baby, a fragile newborn only days old, experienced a catastrophic collapse that clinicians described as an air embolus, an air bubble entering the bloodstream, blocking circulation. It's a rare and often devastating event. On the same nights, other infants suffered unexplained bleeding, sudden seizures, or signs consistent with insulin poisoning in blood results. For grieving parents, the clinical terms offered cold windows into lives that had been prematurely closed. The prosecution later presented evidence that linked many of these collapses to times when she was on duty. They called expert witnesses who testified about unusually high insulin levels, skin discoloration interpreted by some as potential injection sites, and the presence of air in feeding tubes. They pointed to handover sheets removed from the ward, to handwritten notes that prosecutors argued carried the weight of confession. Imagine being a parent who walked into the neonatal unit expecting to feed a tiny baby in a few weeks. Imagine being told that your child had collapsed and that resuscitation had failed. Then imagine being told months later that one person, a nurse you saw as part of the team, had been arrested and accused of intentional harm. Suspicion behaves like a slow-burning fuse. It does not explode instantly, it arcs, it gathers, nurses swapping shifts, a manager noting an unusual number of incidents during particular duty patterns, consultants asking to remove a colleague from clinical care. These are the small structural breaks that, stitched together, can suggest intent. For those on the ward, every resuscitation was a wound. For investigators, each wound became a data point. It is important and hard to hold in mind both of these truths at once: the raw, aching grief of bereaved families, and the clinical, technical language used in court. One side asks, was this medical tragedy? The other asks, was it deliberate? That tension between human loss and medical technicality would become the defining friction of the whole case. The formal investigation that followed was thorough and prolonged. Police operations of this scale require patience, expertise, and a willingness to reread 1,000 pages of records. Cheshire Constabulary eventually led Operation Hummingbird, a wide-ranging inquiry that would review nearly every neonatal collapse and death within a period of years. Clinicians and statisticians map incidents against rota sheets and shift patterns. They asked whether the frequency of collapses when a single person was on duty exceeded what could reasonably be explained by chance. External pediatricians and experts examined clinical notes, blood results, medication records, and any abnormalities. Some noted unusual blood glucose readings. In certain cases, blood tests suggested insulin levels or signs that, in the view of prosecutors, were not typical of natural neonatal decline. Forensic pathologists evaluated cause of death where possible and interpreted unusual findings, like air in gastric tubes or particular patterns of bleeding. These details became central in court, where cause is argued from competing medical opinions. After years of review and multiple arrests, starting in 2018, charges were brought. The charging process, the bail applications, and the slow unspooling of the investigation became public only in fragments. The accused maintained their innocence throughout, denying any wrongdoing and pointing to staffing issues, system failings, and the randomness of neonatal deterioration. When the case reached Manchester Crown Court, the proceedings were intense and long. Testimony ran for months, for over 10 months in the main trial, with medical experts on both sides painting starkly different pictures. The prosecution assembled a narrative, clusters of similar incidents, the defendant's presence during many of them, allegedly suspicious handwritten notes, and clinical markers suggestive of deliberate harm. The defense countered with alternate explanations: coincidence, statistical clustering, natural complications of prematurity, and errors in the interpretation of clinical data. Family members sat in the public gallery. Some gave victim impact statements. The legal choreography, barristers probing witness testimony, judges ruling on evidence, jurors weighing complex medical science, was careful and exacting. For viewers and listeners, the courtroom scenes were both clinical and deeply human, witness after witness describing the tiny lives that never had a chance. Not all charges were immediately resolved in the first trial. Some counts led to acquittals. On others, the jury could not reach verdicts. One of those unresolved charges was retried in mid-2024. The retrial resulted in another conviction, extending the catalog of verdicts against the former nurse. But conviction history. The original convictions in 2023 and the retrial conviction in 2024 would be central to the legal outcomes and sentencing that followed. The legal verdicts were devastating. After a long trial, guilty verdicts were returned. In August 2023, the jury found the defendant guilty of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to a whole life order, the maximum punishment, meaning no possibility of release. The later retrial conviction in 2024 added to the tally of guilty verdicts. The families of the victims received the legal confirmation that someone had been found responsible. For some, a verdict is relief. For many, the absence of a living child is an absence no sentence can repair. The courtroom cannot give back the lullabies, the first baths, the future that would never be. The Countess of Chester Hospital and its governing trust were widely criticized for their early handling of concerns. Senior management faced scrutiny for allegedly failing to act decisively on clinicians' warnings. The public demanded explanations. How had so many incidents occurred before alarm bells were sounded publicly? The government commissioned inquiries to understand systemic failings in oversight and reporting. Beyond the institutional fallout came calls for policy change, better reporting channels, clearer protections for whistleblowers, and more rigorous oversight in neonatal units, where the margin for error is vanishingly thin. There is a particular ache when the place you trusted to keep the most vulnerable becomes the setting for loss. Neonatal units are meant to be sanctuaries of hope amid fragility, incubators of tomorrow. When that trust fractures, the consequences are profound and generational. We must hold multiple truths together: the families who lost children and deserve answers, the clinicians who raised the alarm and the ones who felt blindsided, the investigators who sifted through records for months, and the legal system that had to translate medical complexity into verdicts. The wounds this case left are not only personal but institutional. A verdict can punish one person, but it cannot alone repair a system that allowed warning signs to blend into the background. As we close, ask yourself this: when an institution whispers that these things happen, who will speak loudly enough to demand proof? Who will ensure that concern becomes action? And how do we, as a society, balance the need for careful, evidence-based justice with the raw, unanswerable pain of parents who will carry the absence of their children forever? This is not only a story about a nurse, a hospital, or a courtroom. It is a story about the fragile promises of care, about how silence and hesitation can cost lives, and about the urgent work of rebuilding trust where it has been broken.